The basement of the MIT physics building smelled like solder and burnt insulation. It was 2:47 a.m. on March 18, 1942, and Robert Hutchins hadn't slept in 31 hours. His hands trembled as he adjusted the copper coil on his makeshift radio receiver, the kind of tremor that came from too much coffee and the weight of knowing something the rest of the world didn't. Outside, Boston slept under blackout curtains. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking American merchant ships faster than the Navy could protect them. In the past 3 months alone, over 80 vessels had gone down along the eastern seaboard. Tankers, freighters, passenger ships, torpedoed in the dark, their crews swallowed by freezing water and burning oil. The newspapers called it the second happy time for the Germans. For American sailors, it was a slaughter. Robert twisted the dial slowly, his ear pressed against the static-filled speaker. His device wasn't supposed to exist. The Federal Communications Commission had banned civilian radio experimentation on most frequencies since Pearl Harbor, claiming national security. Amateur radio operators, hams, they called themselves, had been ordered to dismantle their equipment and stay off the air. The government feared spies, saboteurs, anyone who might communicate with the enemy. But Robert wasn't looking to transmit. He was looking to listen. The idea had come to him during a lecture on electromagnetic propagation. Professor Whitman had been discussing how radio waves behaved at different frequencies, how they bounced off the ionosphere, how they traveled underwater. Robert had raised his hand. "What about submarine communications?" he'd asked. "How do U-boats talk to each other when they're submerged?" Professor Whitman had paused, his chalk hovering above the blackboard. "They don't, Mr. Hutchins. Not effectively. Radio waves don't penetrate seawater well. Submarines must surface to transmit and receive." That's when it clicked. If U-boats had to surface to communicate with their bases in Germany, to report positions, request orders, coordinate attacks, then their transmissions could be intercepted. The problem was frequency. The Navy monitored standard maritime channels, but the Germans were clever. They used obscure frequencies, encrypted codes, brief bursts of transmission that lasted only seconds. By the time Navy direction-finding equipment locked on, the U-boat was gone, submerged again, invisible. But what if someone built a receiver specifically designed to catch those fleeting signals? What if that receiver swept multiple frequencies simultaneously, recording everything for later analysis? Robert had sketched the design on a napkin that same afternoon. 3 months later, in the dim light of a basement he'd broken into with a borrowed key, he was testing the prototype. Static hissed through the speaker, then something else. A sharp, rhythmic pulse. Morse code. Robert's breath caught. He grabbed his notebook, his pencil scratching rapidly as he transcribed the dots and dashes. The transmission lasted only 14 seconds before it vanished. He played it back in his mind, checking his notation. QKX 421 NORD. German. Definitely German. His heart hammered against his ribs. He checked the frequency, 8.4 megahertz, far outside the standard commercial bands, exactly where a submarine might transmit to avoid casual detection. He noted the time, the signal strength, the bearing indicated by his directional antenna. He waited. At 3:12 a.m., another burst. Different call sign, same frequency. Then another at 3:28. And another at 3:45. 4 U-boats. 4 separate submarines, all transmitting within an hour, all within range of his receiver. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against concrete. He needed to tell someone. The Navy. The Coast Guard. Someone who could do something with this information. But who would listen to a 22-year-old physics student with an illegal radio rig built from scavenged parts? He thought of his brother, Michael, a Navy ensign stationed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Michael could get the information to the right people. But Michael had also warned him to stay out of trouble, to focus on his studies, to not do anything stupid. This probably qualified as stupid. Robert looked at his receiver, at the frequencies still glowing on the dial, at the notebook filled with intercepts. Outside, in the darkness of the Atlantic, U-boats were hunting. Men were dying. Ships were burning. He made his decision. He would keep listening. He would map every transmission, every frequency, every pattern. He would build a case so undeniable that even the Navy couldn't ignore it. And he would do it quietly, in this basement, breaking federal law every night until someone listened. He sat back down, adjusted his headphones, and turned the dial. The war had just become personal. By April 3rd, Robert had logged 47 separate U-boat transmissions. He'd developed a system. Each night, from midnight to 6 a.m., he monitored the frequencies. He discovered that U-boats transmitted most frequently between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Eastern Time, when they were surfacing to recharge batteries and send reports to Carnival, the German submarine headquarters in occupied France. They used frequencies between 8 and 12 megahertz, rotating through a predictable pattern every 3 days. The transmissions were encrypted, of course. Robert couldn't read the actual content. But he didn't need to. What mattered were the patterns, the timing, the frequencies, the locations. Using a triangulation method he'd adapted from his electromagnetic theory textbooks, Robert had begun plotting approximate positions. His directional antenna could determine bearing, and by correlating signal strength with known transmission ranges, he could estimate distance. It was crude, imprecise, but it was something. And the pattern was terrifying. The U-boats were operating in groups, wolf packs, he'd heard them called. They'd converge on shipping lanes, coordinate attacks, then disperse before Navy escorts could respond. He'd identified at least 3 separate packs operating between Cape Hatteras and New York. One group seemed to lurk off the New Jersey coast, another near the entrance to Chesapeake Bay, a third prowling the approaches to Boston Harbor. On April 3rd, he intercepted 6 transmissions between 2:15 a.m. and 2:47 a.m., all from the same approximate location, 40 miles southeast of Atlantic City. The signal strength suggested the submarines were close to the surface, likely coordinating. Robert marked the position on his chart, his stomach knotting. A convoy was scheduled to pass through that area at dawn. He'd read about it in the shipping notices his brother occasionally mentioned. 12 merchant ships carrying grain and aviation fuel to Britain, escorted by 2 destroyers. He had to warn someone. He grabbed his notebook and ran. The duty officer at the Brooklyn Navy Yard looked at Robert like he'd suggested the moon was made of cheese. "Let me get this straight," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said, leaning back in his chair. "You've been operating an illegal radio receiver. You've been intercepting what you think are German submarine transmissions. And now you're here to tell the United States Navy where we can find U-boats." "Yes, sir," Robert said, his notebook trembling slightly in his hands. "I've plotted their positions. There's a wolf pack gathering 40 miles off Atlantic City. If the convoy route isn't changed. Son, do you have any idea how many crackpots walk through that door every week?" Hayes interrupted. "We've got housewives claiming they can hear U-boats through their radiators. We've got bus drivers who've invented sonar using coat hangers. We've got—" "I'm a physics student at MIT," Robert cut in, his voice harder than he intended. "I know how radio propagation works. I know what I'm hearing. These are high-frequency transmissions, encrypted Morse code, on frequencies consistent with Kriegsmarine protocols. The patterns match known wolf pack tactics. And there's a convoy heading directly into their hunting ground in—" He checked his watch, 4 hours and 20 minutes. Hayes studied him for a long moment. Then he picked up the telephone. "Get me convoy operations," he said. Then, to Robert, "You better be right about this, kid." The convoy altered course at 5:30 a.m., swinging 20 miles north of its original route. At 6:47 a.m., the SS Oklahoma, A tanker that had been delayed and was racing to catch up with the convoy was torpedoed exactly where Robert had predicted. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky. 8,000 tons of aviation fuel turned the sea into an inferno. Of the 43 crew members, only 7 survived, pulled from the water by a Coast Guard cutter 3 hours later. Their skin was blackened, their lungs seared by burning vapor. 2 died before reaching shore. Robert sat in Hayes's office when the news came through. The radio operator's voice was flat, mechanical, reading casualty figures like baseball scores. Hayes set down the telephone and looked at Robert for a long time. "The convoy made it through," he finally said. "All 12 ships. Because we changed the route." He paused. The Oklahoma didn't get the message in time. Robert felt sick. 7 survivors. 36 dead. Men who'd been eating breakfast, drinking coffee, writing letters home. Gone, because a torpedo had found them in the exact location he'd identified. "How did you know?" Hayes asked quietly. Robert opened his notebook, showing page after page of transcribed transmissions, frequency charts, position plots. "I've been tracking them for 3 weeks. This device," he pulled the circuit diagram from his pocket, "it's designed to sweep multiple frequencies simultaneously. When a U-boat surfaces to transmit, even for 15 seconds, I catch it. The Germans think they're being clever, using obscure frequencies, keeping transmissions short. But they're predictable. They have to be. They're operating under tactical constraints, battery life, patrol schedules, coordination requirements." Hayes studied the diagrams. "This is illegal as hell, you know that?" "Yes, sir." "The FCC could throw you in prison." "Yes, sir." "And you did it anyway." "Men are dying, sir. Every night. And I could hear the submarines that were killing them." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the phone again. "Get me Admiral King's office," he said. "Tell them we have an asset they need to see." By April 15th, Robert's basement operation had moved to a secure facility in Washington, D.C. The Office of Naval Intelligence had given him a team: 3 Navy radio operators, 2 cryptanalysts, and a physicist from Bell Labs. His homemade receiver had been duplicated and improved, with 6 units now monitoring the Atlantic coast from Maine to Florida. The data poured in, dozens of intercepts every night, triangulated positions, pattern analysis. But the Navy wasn't just listening anymore. They were hunting. And the U-boats had started to notice. On the night of April 23rd, Robert intercepted something different. The transmission was longer, almost a minute, and on a frequency he hadn't heard before. His German was rudimentary, but he caught enough to understand. Achtung. Possible compromise. Alter protocols. They knew. Somehow, the Germans had realized their communications were being monitored. Robert's hands went cold. If the U-boats changed their transmission patterns, everything he'd built would become useless. The Navy would lose its only early warning system. The slaughter would continue. "We need to act now," he told Commander Harrigan, the intelligence officer overseeing the program. "Before they switch frequencies, before they change their codes. We have positions on at least 8 submarines. If we hit them simultaneously." "That's not a decision I can make, son," Harrigan said. "Then find someone who can." The order came down 6 hours later. Operation Drumbeat Counterstrike would launch at dawn. The destroyer USS Roper cut through the Atlantic at 28 knots, her sonar pinging rhythmically into the darkness below. It was 3:47 a.m. on May 9, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton Howe stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon. Somewhere ahead, according to the intelligence report from Washington, a German U-boat was operating. The radio intercept had been specific: position, bearing, even an estimated surfacing time. Howe didn't know how naval intelligence had obtained the information. He didn't need to know. His job was simple: find the submarine and kill it. "Sonar contact," the operator called out. "Bearing 027, range 1,200 yards. Contact is submerged, moving slowly." Howe's pulse quickened. Battle stations. Prepare depth charges. The alarm shrieked through the ship. Men scrambled to their posts, the practiced chaos of combat preparation. The roper heeled to starboard, turning toward the contact. 1,200 yards became 800, 600, 400. "Contact maintaining depth, sir." 60 feet. "Fire pattern Delta," Howe ordered. "Full spread." The depth charges rolled off the stern in sequence, 300-pound cylinders of high explosive, each set to detonate at different depths. They hit the water with heavy splashes, sinking rapidly. The sea erupted. 6 explosions hammered the ocean, white geysers blasting skyward, shock waves rippling outward. The roper shuddered from the detonations. Men grabbed railings, steadying themselves. "Contact lost in the disturbance," sonar reported. "Searching." Howe waited, counting seconds. If they'd missed, the U-boat would be running deep, trying to escape. If they'd damaged it, there would be debris, oil, maybe bodies. "Sir." The lookout pointed. "Surface contact, dead ahead." The submarine broke through the waves like a wounded whale, its conning tower emerging at a steep angle, seawater pouring from its flanks. The U-boat was coming up, either damaged and unable to maintain depth, or surfacing intentionally to fight. "All guns, open fire." The roper's deck guns roared. 3-inch shells slammed into the surfacing submarine, metal striking metal with sharp, resonant clangs. Tracer rounds from the 20mm cannons stitched across the conning tower, sparking and ricocheting. The U-boat's deck gun swung toward them, but before it could fire, another shell struck home. The German gun crew scattered, bodies tumbling into the sea. "Torpedoes in the water!" someone screamed. Howe spun the wheel hard. The roper heeled violently, turning inside the torpedo's turning radius. The deadly fish passed down their starboard side, missing by 30 yards, its phosphorescent wake glowing in the darkness. "Ramming speed!" Howe shouted. The destroyer surged forward, engines screaming. The U-boat was wallowing now, its bow rising, stern settling, definitely damaged, probably flooding. German sailors were emerging from the hatches, abandoning ship. The roper's bow struck the submarine amidships with a grinding, tearing crash. Steel buckled. The impact threw everyone forward. Howe caught himself against the windscreen, his shoulder slamming hard enough to bruise. The U-boat rolled onto its side. Water poured into the open hatches. Men were in the water now, swimming, shouting in German, screaming for help. "Cease fire," Howe ordered. "Prepare to recover survivors." The roper circled slowly, searchlights illuminating the scene. The submarine was going down, slipping beneath the waves in a churning maelstrom of bubbles and debris. Men clung to wreckage, to each other, their faces pale in the harsh light. The destroyer's crew threw lines, pulled Germans aboard, soaked, shivering, defeated. 14 survivors. 33 drowned or killed in the attack. U-352 had been operating off the Carolina coast for 16 days. It had sunk no ships. Its war was over. 300 miles north, the destroyer USS Noah was hunting another contact. The pattern repeated throughout the night. Destroyers, corvettes, Coast Guard cutters, all vectored toward positions identified by Robert's intercept network. Some found nothing. The submarines had already moved. But others found their targets. U-701, caught on the surface while transmitting, was strafed by an Army bomber and forced to dive damaged. It would survive only 3 more weeks before being sunk off Cape Hatteras. U-576 was caught in a convoy battle, depth-charged relentlessly until it surfaced, crippled. It managed to torpedo 1 merchant ship before aircraft finished it off. All hands lost. By dawn on May 10th, 3 U-boats had been destroyed and 4 more damaged or driven off. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the hunters had become the hunted. In Washington, Robert listened to the reports coming in, each casualty figure, each confirmed kill. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, complicated weight. Men had died tonight. German sailors, young men like himself, drowning in the dark Atlantic because he'd discovered how to find them. Commander Harrigan clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, son. Damn good." Robert nodded numbly. Good. They'd won a battle, maybe shifted the balance slightly. But the war was far from over, and the Germans were already adapting. A new intercept came through at 6:23 a.m. The transmission was brief, heavily encrypted, but the pattern analysis flagged it immediately. "They're changing frequencies," one of the crypt analysts said. "New protocol, new transmission schedule. It's going to take us weeks to recalibrate." Robert stared at the oscilloscope, watching the signal trace dance across the screen. The U-boats were learning. They'd realized their communications had been compromised. They'd become more cautious, more sophisticated. But so would he. "Get me a direct line to the Navy's Radio Intelligence Unit," he said. "And find me every physicist on the East Coast who knows anything about high-frequency propagation. We're starting over. Better equipment, wider coverage, faster analysis." Harrigan raised an eyebrow. "You're just a student, Hutchins. You're not actually enlisted." "Then enlist me," Robert said flatly. "Because I'm not stopping." The war had changed him. He'd heard the dots and dashes of men about to die. He'd plotted their positions, sent ships to kill them, and listened to the casualty reports afterward. There was no going back to differential equations and lab reports. He was a hunter now. And the Atlantic still had wolves. Robert Hutchins received his Naval Intelligence Commission on June 3, 1942. The ceremony was private, conducted in a windowless room at the Navy Department building. No family attended. His brother Michael stood as witness, proud but worried. Robert's mother didn't know what he was doing, only that he'd volunteered for important war work. His father, who'd served in the First War, would have understood. But his father was dead. By July, the radio intercept program, now codenamed Project Echo, had expanded to 12 listening stations along the Atlantic coast. Robert's original basement receiver had evolved into sophisticated direction-finding equipment, capable of triangulating U-boat positions within a 5-mile radius. The Navy credited the program with 12 confirmed submarine kills and 17 successful convoy routings by the end of summer. But the cost was mounting in ways the casualty reports didn't capture. Robert worked 18-hour days, analyzing intercepts, refining equipment, training new operators. He slept in a cot next to the radio room, waking whenever a significant transmission came through. His hands developed a permanent tremor from too much coffee and too little rest. His weight dropped 23 pounds. The headaches started in August and never really stopped. He listened to men die in real time. On the night of August 14th, he intercepted a distress call from U-464, a Type 14 supply submarine torpedoed south of Iceland. The transmission was frantic, unencrypted, standard procedure when a U-boat was sinking and desperate. Robert heard the German radio man sending coordinates, requesting rescue, his Morse code becoming increasingly erratic as the submarine flooded. The transmission lasted 6 minutes. Then silence. 184 seconds of dots and dashes, and then nothing. 53 men. Gone. Robert sat at his station, his hands still transcribing even after the signal stopped, muscle memory continuing the pattern. Someone, one of the new operators, a kid from Iowa who couldn't have been older than 19, touched his shoulder gently. "Lieutenant? The transmission's over." Robert looked down at his notebook. The last lines were illegible, his handwriting dissolving into meaningless scratches. He stood abruptly and walked out. He found Commander Harrigan in the operations room, studying charts of the mid-Atlantic. "I need a transfer," Robert said without preamble. Harrigan looked up, unsurprised. "Where to?" "Anywhere. Anywhere that isn't listening." Harrigan gestured to a chair. Robert sat. The commander poured 2 whiskeys from a bottle in his desk drawer, not regulation, but nobody cared anymore, and slid one across. "You've saved thousands of lives," Harrigan said quietly. "The convoys getting through because you warned them, the merchant sailors who went home to their families. That counts, Robert." "I know the math," Robert said. "I know the numbers justify it. But I can hear them. Every night. German kids, typing out messages to mothers they'll never see again. Men trapped in steel coffins, drowning in the dark. And I'm the reason they're dying. The war is the reason they're dying. I'm the weapon that finds them." Harrigan sipped his whiskey. "You want to know the truth? We're losing. Not as badly as we were 6 months ago, thanks to you, but we're still losing. The Germans are building U-boats faster than we can sink them. They're adapting to every countermeasure we develop. Project Echo has bought us time, but it's not enough. We need codebreakers to crack Enigma. We need radar that works in bad weather. We need escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft and sonar that can track deeper than 200 feet. So my work doesn't matter? Your work matters enormously. It's also not sufficient. Nothing one person does is sufficient in a war this big." Harrigan leaned forward. "But here's what I can tell you. Last month, Convoy HX-203 made it across the Atlantic with 0 losses. All 47 ships arrived safely. You know why? Because you identified the wolf pack waiting for them, and we routed them 200 miles north. Those ships carried tanks, aircraft, ammunition, equipment that'll be used to invade Europe someday. And on those ships were 3,000 merchant sailors who are alive right now because you lost sleep listening to static." Robert stared at his whiskey. "It doesn't feel like winning." "Winning never does. Not while you're doing it." Robert stayed. Through 1943 and into 1944, Project Echo evolved. The introduction of shipboard high-frequency direction-finding equipment, HFDUF, allowed convoy escorts to detect U-boat transmissions directly. Robert's intercept network became part of a larger Allied anti-submarine intelligence apparatus, feeding information to Atlantic Convoy Command, Coastal Command, and eventually to Bletchley Park's cryptanalysis teams. The Battle of the Atlantic turned slowly. The German U-boat fleet, which had seemed invincible in 1942, began to suffer catastrophic losses. Improved sonar, radar, depth charges, air cover, and the ability to predict where U-boats would be based on their radio transmissions, combined to create a killing ground for submarines. By May 1943, Admiral Donitz withdrew the U-boats from the North Atlantic, admitting defeat in the crucial convoy routes. The Allies called it Black May. The Germans lost 43 U-boats in 30 days. Robert didn't celebrate. He knew the names of some of those submarines. He'd tracked them for months, learned their patrol patterns, recognized their radio operators by their distinctive Morse code rhythms, some fast and precise, others hesitant, almost musical. U-954's radio man always tapped 3 quick dots before beginning a transmission, like clearing his throat. U-264's operator consistently misspelled certain German words, probably from a regional dialect. U-403 signals came at exactly 0347 hours every third night, with a regularity Robert could set his watch by. They were men, doing their jobs, following orders. And now they were statistics in an after-action report. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Robert was promoted to lieutenant commander and offered a permanent position with naval intelligence. He declined. His hands shook too badly to operate radio equipment anymore. The headaches had become migraines, the insomnia chronic. The Navy doctors used words like exhaustion and nervous strain and recommended rest. He returned to MIT in September 1945 to complete his degree. He was 25 years old but felt 50. He sat in the same lecture halls where he dreamed up his illegal radio receiver, surrounded by students who'd never heard a U-boat die. He tried to focus on his studies: electromagnetic theory, quantum mechanics, circuit design. But the equations reminded him of frequency calculations, triangulation methods, the mathematics of hunting. One afternoon, Professor Whitman pulled him aside after class. "I heard what you did during the war," the professor said quietly. "I can't know the details. I'm sure they're classified. But I heard you made a significant contribution to anti-submarine operations." Robert nodded, non-committal. "Does it bother you?" Whitman asked. "The ethical dimension of it?" Robert considered the question. "I don't know if bother is the right word. I spent 3 years listening to men communicate, and then I gave their positions to people who killed them. It was necessary. It saved Allied lives. It shortened the war. But necessary doesn't mean easy, and right doesn't mean comfortable." "Do you regret it?" "No." The answer came quicker than he expected. "I regret that it had to happen. I regret every man who died, on both sides. But if I had to make the choice again, knowing what I know now, I'd do the same thing. Because the alternative was worse." Whitman nodded slowly. "That's the burden of useful knowledge, Robert. Sometimes the most moral choice still requires you to do something terrible." Robert graduated in 1947 with highest honors. He was recruited by Bell Labs, RCA, and 3 government agencies whose names he wasn't allowed to mention. He chose a small electronics firm in New Jersey, designing civilian radio equipment. Nothing classified, nothing military. He married in 1949. His wife, Catherine, was a librarian who'd never asked him about the war until their 3rd date. When he finally told her, a sanitized version, leaving out the parts that still woke him at night, she'd simply held his hand and said, "That must have been hard." It was the most understanding thing anyone had ever said to him. They had 2 children. Neither went into physics. His daughter became a teacher, his son a carpenter. Robert was quietly grateful. In 1958, on the 16th anniversary of the sinking of U-352, Robert drove to the Naval Memorial in Washington. He stood before the Wall of Names, American sailors lost at sea, and then walked to a quieter corner of the memorial, where someone had placed a small plaque. "In memory of all mariners lost in the Atlantic, 1939 to 1945. It didn't specify which side. Robert appreciated that. He thought about the German radio man on U-464, the one who'd sent the distress call, his Morse becoming frantic as water rose. He thought about the men on the SS Oklahoma, burning in their own fuel. He thought about the convoy sailors who'd made it home because he'd rerouted their ships. He thought about his illegal radio receiver in a MIT basement, and how one student's curiosity had become a weapon. Wars are won by logistics and strategy and industrial might. But they're also won by individuals making choices, small choices that accumulate into large consequences. Robert had made a choice to listen, and men had lived and died because of it. He stood there for a long time, in the autumn sunlight, surrounded by the names of the dead. Then he went home to his family, to a life built on the other side of all that darkness, and he tried, as he had every day for 13 years, to believe it had been worth it. Some days he succeeded.